The night pressed close around her, thick with the scent of pine and the hush of a world holding its breath. Harriet moved with the caution of a hunted animal, each step deliberate, each pause a prayer. The sky above was a velvet canopy, scattered with stars so bright they seemed to pulse with secret messages. She had learned to read them, to trust the North Star's steady gleam, to let it guide her feet through the tangled Maryland woods. The air was cold, sharp enough to sting her lungs, but she welcomed the pain. It meant she was alive, it meant she was moving, it meant she was free, at least for this moment, in this darkness, with the slave catcher's dogs far behind and the promise of freedom somewhere ahead. She could hear her own breath, ragged and quick, and the faint rustle of leaves as she brushed past low branches. Every sound was magnified, the distant hoot of an owl, the snap of a twig beneath her bare foot, the soft rush of wind through the trees. She carried nothing but a scrap of cornbread in her pocket and the memory of her father's whispered instructions. "Keep to the water when you can, Minty," he had told her, using the name her mother gave her. "Dogs lose your scent in the creek." She remembered the way his hands had trembled as he pressed a small, battered compass into her palm, the only inheritance he could offer. She remembered her mother's voice, low and fierce, singing spirituals that were more than songs, they were codes, maps, promises. Harriet's mind flickered back to the plantation, to the endless days in the fields, the ache in her back, the sting of the overseer's whip. She remembered the faces of her brothers and sisters, the way they had clung to each other in the darkness, whispering dreams of escape. She remembered the night she had first spoken the words aloud, "I am going to be free." The others had stared at her, wide-eyed, torn between hope and terror. Freedom was a dangerous word, a word that could get you killed. But Harriet had felt it burning inside her, a fire that would not be quenched. She moved through the night, guided by instinct and faith. The woods were alive with unseen dangers, snakes, wild animals, men with guns and lanterns, but she pressed on, her heart pounding with fear and exhilaration. She thought of the stories she had heard as a child, stories of Moses leading his people out of bondage, stories of miracles and deliverance. She wondered if God was watching her now, if he would send a sign, a pillar of cloud or fire to light her way. She had always felt close to God, especially since the injury that had nearly killed her. She remembered the day it happened, the sudden blow to her head, the blinding pain, the visions that had followed. She had lain in bed for weeks, drifting in and out of consciousness, haunted by dreams and voices. When she finally rose, she was changed. She saw things others could not see, heard things others could not hear. Some called her touched, others called her blessed. Harriet called it her gift, her burden, her calling. The path grew steeper, the trees denser. She stumbled once, catching herself on a root, and bit back a cry. She could not afford to make noise. She pressed on, her muscles trembling with exhaustion, her mind fixed on the promise of freedom. She thought of her mother, Rit, who had endured so much, who had watched her children sold away one by one. She thought of her father, Ben, who had taught her to read the woods, to listen to the language of birds and the whisper of the wind. She thought of the men who owned her, who believed they could break her spirit with chains and violence. She thought of the God who had whispered to her in her darkest moments, "You are not alone." As dawn approached, the sky lightened to a pale gray, and Harriet found herself at the edge of a wide, slow-moving river. She hesitated, scanning the banks for signs of danger. The water was cold, but she waded in, feeling the mud suck at her feet, the current tug at her legs. She moved carefully, keeping her head low, her eyes fixed on the far shore. When she reached the other side, she collapsed on the bank, gasping for breath, her body shaking with relief and exhaustion. She lay there for a moment, staring up at the sky, watching the first rays of sunlight filter through the trees. She was still alive. She was still free. The journey had only begun. There would be more rivers to cross, more dangers to face. But Harriet felt a fierce joy rising in her chest. She had done what so many said was impossible. She had run away. She had defied the men who claimed to own her, defied the laws that said she was property, defied the fear that had kept her chained for so long. She rose to her feet, brushed the mud from her dress, and began to walk north. Harriet's story began long before that night in the woods. She was born Araminta Ross, called Minty by her family, on a plantation in Dorchester County, Maryland, sometime around 1822. The exact date was lost to history, as were the names of so many who lived and died in bondage. Her parents, Ben and Rit, were both enslaved, but they belonged to different masters. This meant that even as a child, Harriet lived with the constant threat of separation, the knowledge that her family could be torn apart at any moment. She learned early that love was a dangerous thing, that every embrace might be the last. Her earliest memories were of work, hard, unending work. She was hired out as a nursemaid when she was just 5 or 6, tasked with rocking a white baby to sleep and keeping it quiet. If the child cried, Harriet was whipped. She bore the scars for the rest of her life. Later, she was sent to work in the fields, hauling heavy loads, setting traps for muskrats, chopping wood. She grew strong, her muscles hardened by labor, her spirit tempered by suffering. But there was joy, too, in the small moments, the laughter of her siblings, the warmth of her mother's arms, the songs they sang in the darkness. Music was a lifeline, a way to remember, a way to hope. Harriet learned the old spirituals, songs that spoke of deliverance and freedom, songs that carried hidden meanings. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. She sang them softly as she worked, letting the words fill her with courage. The world of the plantation was a world of violence and fear. Harriet saw her sisters sold away, heard the screams of mothers torn from their children. She saw men and women beaten, starved, humiliated. She learned to keep her head down, to hide her anger, to wait for the right moment. But she never forgot. The memory of those losses burned inside her, fueling her determination to escape. When she was a young teenager, Harriet suffered the injury that would change her life. She was sent to a dry goods store to fetch supplies, and while she was there, she witnessed an overseer trying to capture a runaway slave. The overseer demanded Harriet help restrain the men, but she refused. In the chaos that followed, the overseer hurled a 2-pound weight at the fugitive, but it struck Harriet instead, crushing her skull. She collapsed, bleeding and unconscious, and was left for dead. For months, she drifted between life and death, plagued by seizures, headaches, and strange visions. She saw angels, heard the voice of God, felt herself lifted out of her body. When she finally recovered, she was never the same. The visions continued throughout her life, guiding her, warning her, comforting her in times of danger. Harriet's faith deepened after the injury. She believed God had spared her for a reason, that she was meant for something greater. She began to pray for deliverance, not just for herself but for all her people. She listened for God's voice in the wind, in the rustle of leaves, in the songs of birds. She learned to trust her instincts, to follow the signs that others ignored. As she grew older, Harriet married a free black man named John Tubman. The marriage offered her no protection from slavery, but it gave her a new name and a measure of hope. She dreamed of escaping with John, of building a life together in freedom. But John was afraid. He warned her not to run, threatened to betray her if she tried. Harriet realized she would have to go alone. The decision to flee was not made lightly. Harriet knew the risks. She had seen what happened to those who were caught, the whippings, the mutilations, the hangings. She knew the slave catchers would hunt her, that the law was not on her side. The Fugitive Slave Act made it legal for anyone, anywhere, to capture and return runaways. But Harriet was determined. She waited for the right moment, gathered what little she could carry, and set out under cover of darkness. The journey north was a test of endurance and faith. Harriet traveled by night, hiding in swamps and thickets by day. She followed the North Star, listened for the songs of friendly birds, watched for the signs left by those who had gone before. She found allies along the way, Quakers, free blacks, abolitionists who risked their lives to help her. She learned to trust no one, to move quickly and quietly, to change her route at a moment's notice. She crossed rivers, scaled fences, crawled through mud and brambles. She went hungry, cold, and afraid, but she never turned back. The nights on the road were long and fraught with peril, each mile a test of endurance and resolve. Harriet Tubman moved quietly through the underbrush, her senses sharpened by necessity, every sound a possible warning. the barking of distant dogs would send a chill through the group, and she would press her finger to her lips, signaling silence. Sometimes the moon was bright enough to cast shadows, and she would lead her passengers off the main path, into the tangled heart of the forest, where the branches clawed at their clothes and the ground was soft with moss and mud. She knew the land intimately, every creek and hollow, every patch of wild berries that might offer a brief respite from hunger. There were moments when fear threatened to overwhelm those she guided. The stories of slave catchers, of men with guns and lanterns, of the iron chains that awaited them if they were caught, weighed heavily on their minds. Some would falter, their courage wavering as the journey stretched on, and Harriet would gather them close, her voice low and steady. She would remind them of the promise of freedom, of the loved ones waiting on the other side, of the life that could be theirs if only they pressed on. She sang to them, the old spirituals that carried hidden meanings, her voice weaving hope into the darkness. "There's a balm in Gilead," she would sing, and the melody would settle their nerves, give them strength to take another step. The weather was often an enemy. Rain would turn the paths to rivers of mud, soaking their clothes and chilling them to the bone. In winter, the cold was relentless, biting through thin garments, numbing fingers and toes. Harriet would huddle with her passengers beneath makeshift shelters, sharing what little food they had, her own body a shield against the wind. She had learned to read the signs of the sky, to sense when a storm was coming, to find shelter in abandoned barns or the hollow of a fallen tree. Hunger was a constant companion, and she became adept at foraging, gathering wild roots and berries, sometimes risking a quick visit to a friendly farmhouse where a sympathetic hand might offer bread or a cup of milk. Trust was a rare and precious commodity. The network of the Underground Railroad was built on secrecy and faith, but betrayal was always a possibility. Harriet learned to judge character quickly, to sense when a promise was genuine and when it was laced with danger. She relied on coded messages, on songs sung in the fields, on lanterns placed in windows as silent beacons. She moved from one safe house to another, never staying long, always wary of spies and informants. The people who helped her were as brave as those she led, Quakers who risked their lives and livelihoods, free black families who opened their doors in the dead of night, abolitionists who provided money, maps, and encouragement. Her own health was a constant challenge. The head injury she had suffered as a girl left her with sudden spells of sleep, moments when she would collapse without warning, her mind slipping into dreams filled with visions and voices. These episodes frightened those around her, but Harriet saw them as messages from God, signs that she was on the right path or warnings of danger ahead. She learned to trust these visions, to let them guide her decisions, to find comfort in the sense that she was never truly alone. The threat of violence was ever present. Slave catchers patrolled the roads, their pockets lined with rewards for the capture of runaways. Posters bearing Harriet's description were nailed to trees and tavern doors, the price on her head rising with each successful mission. She disguised herself in men's clothing, carried chickens under her arm to appear as a simple farmhand, changed her name and her story at every turn. She carried a pistol, not just for protection, but as a symbol of her determination. She made it clear to those she led that turning back was not an option, that the risk to the group was too great. "We got to go free or die," she would say, her eyes fierce with conviction. There were moments of terror, moments when the sound of hoofbeats on the road or the flash of a lantern in the distance sent the group scrambling for cover. Harriet would press herself flat against the earth, her heart pounding, her mind racing through possible escape routes. She learned to move quickly and quietly, to leave no trace, to double back and confuse her pursuers. She relied on the kindness of strangers, but she also relied on her own wits, her ability to adapt to changing circumstances, her refusal to give in to fear. Despite the dangers, Harriet never lost a passenger. Her reputation grew, and with it the legend of Moses, the woman who could not be caught, who led her people to freedom again and again. She became a symbol of hope, her name whispered in the slave quarters, her story told around campfires and in secret meetings. She inspired others to join the cause, to risk their own safety for the sake of justice, to believe that change was possible. Each successful journey was a victory, not just for Harriet and those she led, but for the cause of freedom itself. She saw herself as part of a larger struggle, a war against the evil of slavery, a battle for the soul of the nation. She worked tirelessly, raising money, recruiting allies, planning new routes and strategies. She never allowed herself to rest, never allowed herself to forget the faces of those still in bondage, never allowed herself to believe that the work was finished. The years passed, and the country moved closer to war. The tension between North and South grew more intense, the debate over slavery more bitter. Harriet watched these changes with a mixture of hope and dread, knowing that the fate of millions hung in the balance. She continued her work, undeterred by the rising danger, driven by a sense of purpose that would not be denied. Through it all, Harriet Tubman remained steadfast. Her courage, her faith, her unwavering commitment to justice carried her through the darkest nights and the most desperate days. She became not just a conductor on the Underground Railroad, but a symbol of what was possible when one person refused to accept the world as it was and dared to dream of what it could be. Her story was not just her own, but the story of all who yearned for freedom, all who believed in the power of love and faith to overcome even the greatest evil. The memory of Harriet Tubman's footsteps lingered in the soil of Auburn, in the hearts of those who had found shelter beneath her roof, in the voices of the children who played in the fields she had once tended. The world outside her home continued to shift and tremble, the old wounds of slavery and war never fully healed, but within her walls there was a sense of peace, a quiet assurance that love and perseverance could carve out sanctuaries even in the harshest landscapes. Visitors came from distant cities and small towns, some seeking wisdom, others simply wishing to look upon the face of a woman whose legend had grown larger than life. They found her sitting by the window, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze steady and kind. She welcomed them all, offering tea and stories, her laughter ringing out like a bell, her words carrying the weight of experience and the lightness of hope. She spoke often of the people she had known, the men and women whose courage had matched her own, whose names were not written in history books but whose deeds had shaped the world. She remembered the trembling hands of the mothers she had led through the darkness, the wide eyes of children who clung to her skirts, the silent prayers of fathers who dared to dream of freedom. She recalled the faces of those who had risked everything to help her, Quakers who opened their homes, black families who shared what little they had, abolitionists who stood firm in the face of violence and hatred. She honored their memory with every breath, reminding her listeners that the struggle for justice was never the work of one alone, but of many hearts beating as one. As the years wore on, Harriet's body grew frail, but her mind remained sharp. She read the newspapers, keeping abreast of the world's changes, rejoicing in every victory for justice, mourning every setback. She followed the progress of the suffrage movement, cheering the women who marched and spoke and demanded their rights. She wrote letters to friends and allies, urging them to continue the fight, to remember the sacrifices of those who had come before. She counseled the young, encouraging them to seek education, to build lives of purpose and meaning, to never forget the power of faith and determination. In the evenings, as the sun set over the fields, Harriet would sit on her porch, watching the sky turn gold and crimson. She found comfort in the rhythms of nature, in the changing of the seasons, in the knowledge that life moved in cycles of struggle and renewal. She spoke softly to those who sat beside her, sharing memories of the old days, of the journeys through the night, of the moments when hope seemed lost but was found again in the kindness of strangers or the strength of a song. She sang the old spirituals, her voice thin but unwavering, the words carrying across the fields like a benediction. Harriet's home became a place of pilgrimage, a beacon for those who sought inspiration or solace. Veterans of the Civil War came to pay their respects, recalling the days when she had nursed their wounds or guided them through enemy territory. Former slaves arrived, some now prosperous, others still struggling, all grateful for the chance to thank the woman who had risked her life for theirs. Children gathered at her feet, their eyes wide with wonder as she spoke of the North Star, of the secret codes and hidden paths, of the faith that had carried her through the darkest nights. As her health declined, Harriet was cared for by friends and family, by the residents of the home she had founded, by the community she had built. She bore her suffering with patience, her spirit undiminished by pain. She spoke often of her dreams, of the visions that had guided her, of the sense that her work was not yet finished. She urged those around her to keep fighting, to keep believing, to keep loving. She reminded them that the journey to freedom was never easy, that it required sacrifice and courage, but that it was always worth the cost. In her final days, Harriet's thoughts turned often to her childhood, to the fields of Maryland, to the faces of her parents and siblings, to the songs her mother had sung in the darkness. She remembered the pain of loss, the fear of separation, the longing for a world where families could stay together, where no one was bought or sold. She prayed for those still suffering, for those still searching for freedom, for those who would come after her. She asked God to give them strength, to guide their steps, to fill their hearts with hope. When the end came, it was gentle. Harriet slipped away surrounded by love, her hand held by those she had saved, her name spoken with reverence and gratitude. The news of her passing spread quickly, and people from all walks of life paused to honor her memory. Newspapers published obituaries, churches held services, communities gathered to remember the woman who had changed the course of history. Her funeral was a celebration of her life, a testament to the impact she had made, a reminder that one person's courage could alter the fate of a nation. In the years that followed, Harriet Tubman's legacy grew. Her story was told and retold, her name invoked by those who marched for civil rights, who fought for justice, who believed in the power of love to overcome hate. Statues were erected in her honor, schools and streets named after her face proposed for the nation's currency. Historians uncovered new details of her life, scholars debated her strategies and motivations, artists painted her portrait, writers penned poems and plays in her memory. During her missions on the Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman faced a wide range of challenges that tested her courage, resourcefulness, and faith. She had to navigate through dangerous terrain, often traveling by night through dense forests, swamps, and rivers to avoid detection. The threat of slave catchers and patrols was constant, large rewards were offered for her capture, and she risked severe punishment or death if caught. Tubman also had to contend with the fear and exhaustion of those she was leading. Many were terrified of being caught and some considered turning back, which could endanger the entire group. To prevent this, she carried a pistol and made it clear that turning back was not an option, famously saying, "You'll be free or die." Harriet also faced the challenge of finding food, shelter, and safe passage for her groups. She relied on a secret network of abolitionists, free black families, and sympathetic Quakers, but trust was always a concern, as betrayal could mean disaster. The weather was another obstacle. She and her groups often traveled in harsh conditions, cold, rain, and snow, without adequate clothing or supplies. Tubman's own health was a challenge as well. She suffered from severe headaches and sudden sleeping spells as a result of a head injury she sustained as a teenager, yet she pressed on regardless. Despite these dangers, Harriet Tubman never lost a passenger on her missions. Her ability to adapt, her deep knowledge of the land, her use of coded songs and signals, and her unwavering faith helped her overcome the many obstacles she faced on the road to freedom. If you would like more detail or specific stories from her missions, let me know and I can continue. Yet for all the honors and accolades, Harriet's true legacy lived on in the lives she had touched, in the families she had reunited, in the hope she had inspired. She remained a symbol of resilience, of faith, of the unbreakable human spirit. Her story was a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was light to be found, that even in the face of overwhelming odds, there was reason to hope. The world continued to change, new struggles arose, new voices joined the chorus for justice. But through it all, the memory of Harriet Tubman endured, a guiding star for those who sought freedom, a beacon for those who believed in the possibility of a better world. Her footsteps echoed through the generations, her words carried on the wind, her spirit alive in every act of courage, every gesture of kindness, every dream of liberty. And so, as the years passed and the world moved forward, Harriet Tubman's story remained, a testament to the power of one life, lived with purpose and love, to change the course of history. Her journey from the fields of Maryland to the halls of freedom was not just her own, but the journey of a people, the journey of a nation, the journey of all who believe that justice is worth fighting for, that freedom is worth any price, that love is the greatest force of all. Harriet's courage inspired others. She met John Brown, the fiery abolitionist who dreamed of sparking a slave uprising. She listened to his plans, offered her support, prayed for his success. She believed in the power of righteous violence, in the necessity of sacrifice. When Brown was captured and hanged after the raid on Harper's Ferry, Harriet mourned his loss, but she did not lose hope. She believed that the struggle would continue, that justice would prevail. When the Civil War erupted, Harriet saw it as a sign that God was moving in history, that the time for deliverance had come. She traveled to South Carolina, where she worked as a nurse, tending to wounded soldiers and sick refugees. She organized a network of scouts and spies, gathering intelligence for the Union Army. She moved among the soldiers with quiet authority, her presence a comfort to the frightened and the dying. She led raids behind enemy lines, guiding Union troops through the swamps and rivers she knew so well. The Combahee River Raid was her greatest triumph. In the darkness before dawn, Harriet led a group of Union soldiers up the river, past Confederate pickets and hidden mines. She had gathered intelligence from local slaves, learned the location of enemy troops, mapped the safest routes. As the boats approached the shore, she sang softly, a signal to those waiting in the fields. Hundreds of men, women, and children rushed to the river, fleeing their masters, climbing aboard the boats. Harriet moved among them, urging them on, comforting the frightened, guiding the lost. When the raid was over, more than 700 people had been freed. It was a victory not just for the Union, but for the cause of freedom. After the war, Harriet returned to Auburn, New York, where she had settled with her family. She continued to fight for justice, working for women's suffrage, founding a home for the elderly, speaking out against racism and injustice. She lived simply, giving away what little she had to those in need. She was honored by some, ignored by others, but she never wavered in her commitment to freedom. Harriet Tubman's life was a testament to the power of faith, courage, and love. She endured unimaginable suffering, faced impossible odds, and never lost sight of her purpose. She was a conductor of freedom, a beacon of hope, a warrior for justice. Her story lives on, not just in the pages of history but in the hearts of all who strive for a better world. In Auburn, the seasons turned with a quiet rhythm, and Harriet Tubman found herself surrounded by the land she had chosen for her family and for those she would come to shelter. The house she purchased with the help of William H. Seward, Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State and a friend to the cause, stood as a symbol of her hard-won freedom. It was a modest home, but to Harriet, it was a palace compared to the slave cabins of her youth. She filled it with the laughter of nieces and nephews, the warmth of her parents, and the comfort of knowing that here, at least, no one could be sold away. Yet even in this place of relative peace, Harriet's work was far from finished. The war had ended, but the wounds of slavery ran deep, and the nation struggled to heal. Harriet saw the suffering of the newly freed, men and women who wandered the roads in search of lost family, who faced poverty, prejudice, and violence at every turn. She opened her doors to them, offering food, shelter, and guidance. She gave away what little money she had, never thinking of herself, always thinking of others. Her home became a sanctuary, a place where the weary could rest, where the hungry could eat, where the lost could find hope. Harriet's faith remained her constant companion. She prayed each morning, giving thanks for the blessings she had received, asking for strength to continue her work. She attended the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, where her voice rose in song, her spirit lifted by the company of fellow believers. She spoke often of her visions, of the dreams that had guided her through danger, of the sense that God still had work for her to do. She was not content to rest on her laurels, not content to be remembered only for what she had done. She saw the struggles of her people, the injustices that persisted, and she knew she must keep fighting. The cause of women's suffrage called to her, and Harriet joined forces with Susan B. Anthony, Emily Howland, and other leaders of the movement. She traveled to meetings and conventions, speaking in her quiet, powerful way about the need for justice, not just for black people, but for women as well. She told the story of her own life, of the strength and courage of women who had endured the worst the world could offer and still found a way to hope. "I have suffered enough to believe in freedom for all," she would say, her words simple but unyielding. She believed that the right to vote was a natural extension of the freedom she had risked her life to win. Harriet's activism extended beyond words. She founded the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged, a place where elderly black people, many of them formerly enslaved, could live out their days in dignity. She raised money through speaking engagements, through the sale of her biography, through the generosity of friends and supporters. She worked in the garden, cooked meals, tended the sick. She was nurse, counselor, and friend to all who came to her door. Even as her own health declined, she refused to rest, insisting that there was always more to be done. The years took their toll on Harriet's body. The pain in her head grew worse, the seizures more frequent. She moved slowly, her steps measured, her hands gnarled by age and labor. But her eyes remained bright, her spirit undimmed. She welcomed visitors from near and far, sharing stories of her journeys, offering advice and encouragement. Children gathered at her feet, listening wide-eyed as she spoke of the days when she had walked alone through the night, guided only by the stars and her faith. Harriet's fame grew in her later years, though she never sought it. Journalists came to interview her, artists to paint her portrait, politicians to seek her blessing. She accepted these honors with humility, always redirecting attention to the cause of freedom and justice. She spoke of the need for education, for opportunity, for the recognition of the humanity of all people. She urged the young to remember the sacrifices of those who had come before, to carry the torch of liberty into the future. As the 20th century dawned, Harriet watched the world change around her. She saw the rise of new leaders, the birth of new movements. She saw the promise of progress, but also the persistence of old hatreds. She mourned the violence that continued to plague her people, the lynchings and riots, the laws that sought to strip away the rights so dearly won. But she never lost hope. She believed that the arc of history bent toward justice, that the seed she had planted would one day bear fruit. In her final years, Harriet was surrounded by those she had helped, by family and friends who loved her. She spent her days in the home she had built, tending her garden, reading her Bible, offering comfort to the sick and the dying. She spoke often of her dreams, of the visions that had guided her, of the sense that her work was not yet finished. She urged those around her to keep fighting, to keep believing, to keep loving. When Harriet Tubman died in 1913, she was mourned by thousands. Her funeral was attended by veterans of the Civil War, by suffragists and abolitionists, by the men and women she had led to freedom. She was buried with military honors, her grave marked by a simple stone that bore her name and the words, "Servant of God, well done." Her legacy lived on in the lives she had touched, in the movements she had inspired, in the nation she had helped to transform. The story of Harriet Tubman is not just the story of one woman's journey from slavery to freedom. It is the story of a people's struggle for dignity, for justice, for the right to live and love as they choose. It is the story of faith in the face of despair, of courage in the face of fear, of hope in the face of hatred. It is a story that continues to inspire, to challenge, to call us to action. Harriet's life reminds us that the fight for freedom is never finished, that each generation must take up the cause anew. She teaches us that even the most humble among us can change the world, that the power of love and faith can overcome the greatest evil. She shows us that the journey to justice is long and hard, but that it is worth every step. As the years pass, Harriet Tubman's name endures. Her face appears on murals and monuments, her story told in classrooms and churches, her example invoked by those who march for justice. She is remembered not as a myth, but as a woman of flesh and blood, a woman who suffered and struggled, who loved and lost, who never gave up. She is remembered as the conductor of freedom, the Moses of her people, the woman who walked alone beneath the stars and led so many to the light. When she finally reached Philadelphia, Harriet felt a joy so fierce it brought her to her knees. She was free. For the first time in her life, she could walk the streets without fear, could speak her mind, could dream of a future. But freedom was bittersweet. She thought of her family, still trapped in bondage, and knew she could not rest while they suffered. She found work as a cook and laundress, saving every penny she could. She made contact with the Underground Railroad, a secret network of safe houses and allies dedicated to helping slaves escape. She learned the routes, the codes, the dangers. She listened to the stories of those who had made it north, and she began to plan. Harriet's first rescue mission was for her own family. She returned to Maryland in disguise, slipping past slave catchers and patrols, risking everything to bring her loved ones to freedom. She moved at night, using songs and signals to communicate, hiding in barns and cellars, trusting in God and her own cunning. She led her brothers north, then her parents, then friends and neighbors. Each journey was a test of nerve and skill, a battle against fear and despair. She carried a pistol, not just for protection but as a warning. Anyone who turned back would endanger the whole group. "You'll be free or die," she told them, her voice steady and unyielding. Over the years, Harriet made at least 13 trips back to the South, rescuing more than 70 people. She became known as Moses, the conductor who never lost a passenger. Her reputation spread, and slaveholders grew desperate to stop her. They posted rewards for her capture, but no one betrayed her. She was too clever, too cautious, too beloved. She changed her appearance, used disguises, altered her routes. She relied on the kindness of strangers, on the courage of her fellow abolitionists, on the strength of her own faith. The work was dangerous and exhausting. Harriet suffered from chronic pain and seizures, the legacy of her head injury. She lived in constant fear of capture, of betrayal, of losing those she loved. But she pressed on, driven by a sense of purpose that would not be denied. She believed she was doing God's work, that every life she saved was a victory against evil. She saw herself as part of a larger struggle, a war for the soul of the nation. As the years passed, the country moved closer to civil war. The debate over slavery grew more bitter, more violent. Harriet became involved in the abolitionist movement, working with figures like Frederick Douglass, William Still, and John Brown. She spoke at meetings, raised funds, shared her story. She was small and slight, barely 5 feet tall, but her presence commanded respect. Her eyes burned with intensity, her voice rang with conviction. She spoke of the horrors she had witnessed, the courage she had seen, the hope that sustained her. She urged others to join the fight, to risk everything for freedom. When the Civil War broke out, Harriet saw it as a divine reckoning, a chance to strike a blow against slavery once and for all. She offered her services to the Union Army, working as a nurse, a cook, and a spy. She traveled to South Carolina, where she organized a network of scouts and informants, gathering intelligence on Confederate positions. She led raids behind enemy lines, guiding Union soldiers through the swamps and rivers she knew so well. Her most famous operation was the Combahee River Raid, in which she helped free more than 700 slaves in a single night. She moved among the soldiers with quiet authority, tending the wounded, comforting the dying, urging them to fight for justice. After the war, Harriet returned to Auburn, New York, where she had settled with her family. She continued to fight for justice, working for women's suffrage, founding a home for the elderly, speaking out against racism and injustice. She lived simply, giving away what little she had to those in need. She was honored by some, ignored by others, but she never wavered in her commitment to freedom. Harriet Tubman's life was a testament to the power of faith, courage, and love. She endured unimaginable suffering, faced impossible odds, and never lost sight of her purpose. She was a conductor of freedom, a beacon of hope, a warrior for justice. Her story lives on, not just in the pages of history but in the hearts of all who strive for a better world. In the years that followed her first taste of freedom, Harriet Tubman's resolve only deepened. The city of Philadelphia, with its bustling streets and the constant hum of commerce, was a world apart from the fields and forests of Maryland. Yet even in this new place, the shadow of slavery lingered. She saw the haunted faces of other fugitives, men and women who had left everything behind for a chance at liberty. She heard the stories whispered in kitchens and church basements, stories of families torn apart, of children sold away, of mothers who wept in the night. Harriet found work where she could, scrubbing floors, washing clothes, cooking for strangers. Each coin she earned was precious, not for herself, but for the purpose she carried in her heart. She saved every penny, denying herself comfort, so that one day she could return for those she loved. The city was alive with abolitionist fervor. Meetings were held in secret, pamphlets passed from hand to hand, names spoken in hushed tones. Harriet listened and learned, her eyes wide, her mind hungry for knowledge. She met men and women who believed, as she did, that slavery was an abomination, a stain on the soul of the nation. She listened to the fiery speeches of Frederick Douglass, whose words rang out like thunder, shaking the complacency of the free. She found allies among the Quakers, whose quiet faith matched her own, and among free black families who opened their homes to those in need. The Underground Railroad was not a railroad at all, but a web of trust and courage, a lifeline stretched across the darkness. Harriet's first journey back to Maryland was a test of everything she had learned. She moved with caution, disguising herself as a field hand, her face hidden beneath a battered hat. She traveled by night, slipping through the shadows, listening for the sound of pursuit. She found her brothers, trembling with fear, and led them north, her voice steady, her hand firm. The journey was perilous, the dangers real, but Harriet's faith never wavered. She sang softly as they walked, the old spirituals that carried hidden messages, wade in the water, God's gonna trouble the water. The songs were a comfort, a code, a promise that they were not alone. Word spread quickly among the enslaved people of Maryland. There was a woman, they said, who could lead you to freedom. She knew the woods and rivers, the safe houses and secret signs. She was fearless, some said, protected by God himself. Others whispered that she was a conjure woman, able to vanish into thin air. Slaveholders cursed her name, posted rewards for her capture, but no one betrayed her. She was too careful, too clever, too beloved. She changed her appearance, altered her routes, trusted only those who had proven themselves. She carried a pistol, not just for protection, but as a symbol of her resolve. "You'll be free or die," she told those she led, her eyes blazing with conviction. Each journey was a test of endurance and faith. Harriet learned to read the signs of the land, the bend of a river, the call of a night bird, the pattern of moss on a tree. She listened to the stories of those she rescued, their hopes and fears, their longing for family and home. She comforted the children, encouraged the weary, urged the fearful onward. She knew that hesitation could mean death, that a single misstep could bring disaster. She relied on the kindness of strangers, on the courage of her fellow abolitionists, on the strength of her own spirit. The work took its toll. Harriet's body ached with old injuries, her head throbbed with pain, her sleep was haunted by visions. She saw herself walking through fields of fire, heard the voices of the dead, felt the weight of every life she carried. But she pressed on, driven by a sense of purpose that would not be denied. She believed she was doing God's work, that every life she saved was a victory against evil. She saw herself as part of a larger struggle, a war for the soul of the nation. As the years passed, Harriet's reputation grew. She became known as Moses, the conductor who never lost a passenger. She led her parents to freedom, carrying her father through the swamps on her back, guiding her mother with gentle words. She rescued friends and strangers alike, moving through the night with the stealth of a shadow. She was welcomed in the homes of abolitionists, honored at meetings, celebrated in song and story. Yet she remained humble, always giving credit to God, always remembering the ones she could not save. The country was changing. The debate over slavery grew more bitter, more violent. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made it even more dangerous for runaways, allowing slave catchers to pursue fugitives into the North, to drag them back to bondage with the blessing of the law. Harriet was undeterred. She traveled further north, leading her charges all the way to Canada, where the long arm of American law could not reach. She worked with William Still, the father of the Underground Railroad, recording the names and stories of those she rescued. She spoke at abolitionist meetings, raising funds, urging others to join the fight.